In this video, we're going to start adding some physics to our rock or our boulder here. So Unity has its own physics system built in. Actually, it kind of has two. It has one for 3D and one for 2D. Now to use this physics system, there's two components that are basically needed to work with physics. So on our rock, to tell Unity that we want physics applied to this, we need to add a component that's called Rigidbody. So if we go to add component and we start typing rigid, you'll see two. Rigidbody, that's for 3D objects, and then 2D. So we want to add a 2D rigidbody. Now what this component does is it tells Unity, apply physics to this object. Now we do have quite a few options of how physics are applied. For the most part right now, we're not going to need to change any of this, but you can adjust the mass, the drag, the rotational or linear drag, angular drag. You can even change the gravity scale. So we have a lot of different options here and we can add constraints. Don't worry about any of that yet. Let's just leave it as is. But now we have a rigid body on here. So if we run our game, this boulder is actually going to fall. So if we watch, now it falls. But notice it fell right through the platforms. It didn't hit them at all. Now that's where the second part of the physics system comes into play. There's another component that we need to add, which is a collider. So there's many different types of colliders as well. If we go to add component and we start typing collider, you're going to see a whole ton here. Now again, we need to make sure we select the 2D ones. If we're using a rigid body 2D and we apply 3D colliders, the ones that don't say 2D, nothing is going to happen because they're treated as an entirely different physics system. So you just need to make sure you always match what you're using. If you're using a rigid body, you need colliders that don't say 2D. And if you're using a rigid body 2D, you need a collider that says 2D. So it's really pretty much that simple. Now the options here are pretty vast. You can set all kind of different colliders. Good practice is figure out whichever type makes the most sense for the object you're using. So we're going to experiment with some of these later, but our rock is basically a circle, so it makes the most sense to use a circle collider. So let's add one of those. Now again, here we get a bunch of options. We're not going to change any of that, but let's run the game and see what happens now. Okay, so we added a collider, but we still just fell through the platform. Now this is because these platforms don't have colliders. So we need to do that. And remember, we were modifying this prefab, but this is an instance of the prefab that I mentioned. So this is kind of like a clone of the original prefab. So if we were to take another rock, drag it in right now, if we look at that, see, we don't have the collider or the rigid body. So we need to make sure we adjust that and push those changes out. If you remember from the prefab video, if we select the object that we modified, we can go up to the prefab thing at the top here, the little menu, click on overrides, and we can click apply all. Now you see the icon changed here because it updated. And now if I drag in rock, if we look at this one also has the collider and the rigid body. So those are things that over time, they become second nature to you. But even then, I guarantee at some point, you're going to forget to do that or something similar at some point, and it's going to cost you a bunch of troubleshooting time. We all do it. It's normal. That's how you learn. So just keep it in the back of your head that if something like that doesn't work, remember to check. Oh, maybe I forgot to apply that to the prefab. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to add a collider to our platforms now. So instead of modifying each of these, since we have 3 platforms in our game here, let's go into the platform prefab itself. And then remember, any change we make in here is going to push out to all of them. So let's double click platform. Now we have a few options here. So I'm just going to actually exit prefab mode for a second. I'm going to show you something here. So let's just pick a random object here. So I'm just going to pick this this object here, this metal one. So if I drag this into my scene and we select it, I'm going to drag it off to the side just so we can see it. And you don't have to follow along with this. This is just to do a little demonstration. So we don't have a collider on this one. If I wanted, what I could do is I could add a collider to this object. So we could add a box collider 2D. And now if you zoom in, you see a little green box around the outside. That's the collider. So now we have a collider on this, but say if we wanted to make a platform of these. So if I just duplicate this a few times, these aren't lining up with Snap because I didn't change the pixels per unit for them. So I'm just going to roughly place these here. You don't have to really worry about it. But let's say we have 4. Now see, I duplicated them. Each one of them has a collider. So if I select all 4, you can see we have 4 different colliders. Each one of them has one. So that's one approach that we can take for our platforms. We could add a collider to each of those little sprites. This does get a bit tricky and confusing, and sometimes too it can get annoying because these little edges between them can sometimes cause weird physics issues where you could have an object that accidentally bumps into them and it rotates wrong, does things like that. And it's just extra work that we don't need to do. So I want to make sure you know you can do that. This is going to work fine. You're going to have 4 colliders, but there's possibilities of extra problems and it's more work for your part. The other option we can do is, let's go back to our prefabs. Let's double click on it. We can just select the top part here. So the empty game object, not all the sprites. And we can add a box collider to this top one. Now in this case, what happens, normally when you add a box collider to an object that has a sprite or something else, Unity is usually smart enough that it'll match the collider to roughly the size. But on this, because it's an empty game object, Unity doesn't know how big we want it. So it just makes a 1-unit collider and it places it on the center. So we have a few ways we can modify this. If you look here, we can see the offset. And anytime you see X and Y values like this, you can click right on them, hold it and drag left or right or up and down, and it's going to change the value. So you can see we can kind of move this around to fit where we want it. So we could do the X and Y like this, or you can manually type the numbers. So I can just type 0.5. And then we can also do the size. And same thing, we can stretch it out and then move it around. So we do have those options, but you also have this edit collider box. If you click this icon, this works just like how we edit a sprite. So we can drag each of these corners to wherever we want them. So I can click this and drag it over here, drag this one over here. So we could go that route, and just to make it exact numbers, now I can just type them in manually. So we can put 2.5 and then 5. Now it fits exactly. So if we do this, now instead of having 5 colliders, or say if this platform was 10 sprites long, we would have to have 10 separate little colliders for each sprite. But in this case, we just make 1. And then if we resize the platform, it's very easy to resize this. Okay, so let's exit back to our game. And now if we select each of these, we can see they all have a box collider here. So now if we run our game, notice our rock hits it and it stops because colliders tell the objects they collide together. Now the difference between these two is we didn't add a rigid body to the platform. So you're going to have different types of objects in your game that act with physics. So we can have objects that are stationary, they don't move around, but they interact with physics. And that's what we have here. We have a collider on it, but we don't have a rigid body. The rigid body is the one that tells it to apply physics. So if we have objects in our game that we want to collide with other objects, we need to make sure they have a collider. And then if we have objects that we want physics applied to, we need to make sure they have a rigid body, and a collider. In this video, we're going to start looking at how we can add force to objects. So most of the time when we add force, we're going to do it through code in a script. But I want to show you a simple component before we start working on programming and making things like that here. So we can select this rock. And there's actually a component we can add called constant force. And we want the 2D one, just like with the rigid body and the collider. And now what this is going to do is apply a constant force to our rigid body. And by force, this means it's going to push our object in a direction. So now that we have the component on, we haven't added any values yet. Let's run the game. And we're going to see our rock fall to the platform right away. So now the rock is sitting here. It has a rigid body, so it is capable of taking forces. It's just not doing anything because it fell flat to the ground from gravity. So with this constant force component, we can go to the force value for, we want to work on the X, because we already have gravity working with the Y, and we can start adding a force. So if we start adding a negative force, it's going to go to the left. Let's run this again. We can start showing a positive value, and that'll make it go to the right. Now, if we put another rock in here, we can show some difference. So let's add a rock on the left here. I'm going to Control D to duplicate. I'm going to add another one here. Now, we're not going to add any force to these, but our main rock here, so it falls down and then we can add some force. And you can see we can actually bump and push these other rocks. So the rock that we bumped into, we didn't apply a force to it via this script, but because it has a rigid body, once other objects hit it, they can push that object based on how much force they have. And then we can demo that on the right side as well. So if we push into it, we can push that one, and we can go back, we can push. And this is kind of how a lot of physics games are made. So you can think of stuff like Angry Birds, or any game where you're just dealing with straight physics. They're going to push objects around, cause collisions, cause items to collapse. Using little features like this and some simple code, you could easily make something like Angry Birds, where you have a bunch of objects stacked together, and then when you hit them, they work naturally with physics to cause them all to collapse. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to delete these other two. And now remember, we added this component. We have to go up to the overrides to apply it, so it's on our prefab now. And later, what we're going to do is create a spawner that spawns these rocks. So then we don't have to actually add code to control how they move. We just tell it how much force we want them to have. And then we set it so they automatically keep spawning, and our player is going to have to avoid and jump over them. Okay, so that's it in this video. I will see you in the next one, and we'll start creating our player.